Hello, and welcome again to Lesser Known Monsters. I'm Kip Evanson. I apologize for the long stretch of time it's taken me to get this episode to you, but we're back, and we have a story for you today that's probably going to make your stomach turn, and make you wonder how such evil on this earth is at all humanly possible. It took place in Kansas City, Missouri in the 80s. 7 young men were brutalized in unimaginable ways for some weeks before 6 of them were slaughtered and literally thrown in the trash. This is the story of Bob Berdella, the Kansas City Butcher. On March 29, 1988, at around 1 o'clock a.m., Chris Bryson crawled into a small Toyota hatchback with another man for an intimate encounter. Little did he know that the driver, Bob Berdella, had already tortured and killed 6 young men, and he was very much planning on Chris being the 7th. Bryson, at the time, was dabbling in male prostitution, occasionally selling himself for drug or alcohol money. Other male prostitutes were aware of the Toyota hatchback and knew not to go with the driver, but Bryson wasn't aware of this and unfortunately did indeed get into the hatchback. The driver was a pudgy, soft-spoken man with a bushy mustache and a slight lisp with thick hair combed straight back, and he immediately introduced himself as Bob and offered Bryson one of the beers that was laying in the back seat. The conversation at first seemed more friendly than anything, and Chris Bryson quietly hoped that this was just a lonely man in need of a friend for the night, and not looking for any intimate encounter. You see, Bryson didn't really enjoy prostituting himself. He just knew it was a fairly quick and easy way to make some cash. Bob offered to take Bryson back to his place to share some Valium and pot. Bryson's idea that Bob was a lonely man in need of only friendship quickly faded when Bob started asking him suggestive questions like, "So, what are you into?" They eventually made it to 4315 Charlotte Street, where Bob lived, and went inside the house. Bryson thought to himself that even though he would have to give himself to this stranger for cash, at least it was at his house and not some crummy motel or a back alley somewhere. The house was a 3-story beige house with an unkept lawn, but it was a decent enough area that Chris didn't think much of it. They walked into the house and Bob offered Chris another beer, which Chris accepted. Chris then lit a cigarette and sat down on the couch. The house was extremely cluttered with what seemed to be junk. Was Bob a collector of some type? It sure seemed like it. Boxes with papers and magazines spilling over the side covered the living area. After offering and retrieving Bryson another beer, Bob told Chris that he has a couple of dogs that aren't very nice and they should probably go upstairs away from them. He showed Chris to the stairs and had Chris walk up first, with Bob following. As Chris Bryson walked up the stairs, Bob Berdella struck him in the back of the head with a metal bar with a fierce blow, knocking Chris unconscious. After dragging an unconscious Bryson into the bathroom, Berdella retrieved his Polaroid camera and began snapping pictures of Chris. Photos standing over him, photos of him propped up against a wall, and then Berdella undressed Chris Bryson and took photos of his nude body. Berdella then dragged Chris into a bedroom and, using the belt from a bathrobe, tied Chris to a bed with his hands above his head attached to a bed frame. Bob then made a makeshift gag from a washcloth and a piece of string and gagged Bryson. Then Berdella attached a dog collar and leash around Chris's neck and tied that to the bedpost as well. Bob then left the room to go take a nap. After waking from his nap around 5:30 in the morning, Bob returned to his captive and began performing deranged, painful experiments on Bryson, keeping detailed log entries in a spiral notebook. At the top of the page, Bob started with Tuesday, a.m. Chris Bryson was still unconscious when Bob crawled on top of him. He had non-penetrating sex with the unconscious Bryson, putting one of his fingers into Bryson's anus. When finished, Bob began writing in his log. This was his first entry. I can't read this out loud, as it's far too graphic, but I trust you can figure out what it means. With the FRTFU, meaning he assaulted Chris sexually from the front, and the finger is, well. Then, at 7:30 a.m., Bob injected Bryson with animal tranquilizer. Then Bob recorded it into his horrible journal, and then covered Bryson's head with a pillowcase. About a half an hour later, Bob returned to a conscious Bryson who was struggling against his restraints. Bob removed the pillowcase and, using his finger, began jabbing Chris in his eyes repeatedly. He then used a cotton-tipped swab to rub drain cleaner into Chris's eyes. Chris tried to avoid the swabs jabbing into both of his eyes, but he couldn't. He also tried screaming, but his gag made that impossible as well. After this was done, Bob then injected drain cleaner into Bryson's neck, right next to his vocal cords. Bob stated to Chris that this was for Bob's security, but warned Chris, "If I ever catch you yelling again, I will inject this straight into your vocal cords and you will no longer have a voice." Bryson then passed out again. Let's back up to the beginning of all this. In 1984, Bob Berdella began dating 19-year-old Jerry Howell. Bob owned a small shop in the Westport flea market called Bob's Bizarre Bazaar, where he sold antiques and other odd items. Jerry Howell's father, Paul Howell, also owned a booth in the flea market right next to Berdella, and they knew each other quite well. Jerry and Bob had an on-again, off-again relationship. There was one time when Jerry got so upset with Bob over telling his father things he was doing that he stopped talking to Bob altogether for a while. But that didn't last, and Bob was able to persuade Jerry back into his life. On July 5th of that year, Bob offered to drive Jerry to a nearby dance competition. That was the last time anyone but Bob would see Jerry alive again. Bob held Jerry Howell captive for around 28 hours, torturing, raping, and drugging him repeatedly. He was violated with foreign objects, and by Bob's own admission in prison, he begged for his life and asked Bob why he was doing this to him. Bob ignored him and continued torturing Howell until 28 hours later when Jerry choked on his own vomit, along with the gag and constant tranquilizers that were too much for him to handle, and he died. Bob then hung Howell upside down in his basement using a pulley he had attached to a beam in the ceiling. He cut his main arteries on the inside of his elbows and his jugular vein, and bled Jerry out completely, leaving him hanging for most of the next day, draining into a giant cooking pot, while Bob worked at the flea market. He then cut him into pieces using a chainsaw and threw Jerry out with the trash, where it would be collected soon after. Jerry Howell's body was never found. When Jerry turned up missing, Paul Howell, Jerry's father, was immediately suspicious of Berdella, knowing that he was the last to be seen with Jerry. He even attacked Bob while they were both working at their booths one day, punching Berdella in the face.
Paul Howell believes his missing 19-year-old son was among them.
They found a head right up here, I believe.
A skull?
A skull right up in this area somewhere. I dug through it trash and found different things. At one time, I thought it was dog remains. Later on, after the investigation, the police come in 3 years later, I found out that this is the way they said Bob disposed of some of the waste of the human remain. He put them in dog food bags and set them out in the trash.
What must it be like to a father to think that his own son was disposed of in pieces in someone's garbage?
It's just very upsetting, naturally, and want to get even. You want to find everybody that's involved beside Bob and hope that it don't happen to anybody else's kids.
Bob insisted to both Paul Howell and the authorities that he had dropped Jerry off at a nearby 7-Eleven and he was alive the last time Bob saw him. It's worth a side note here that Bob used to rent his house out to young, troubled youth, apparently to help them get back on their feet and act as sort of a big brother to the young men. But it has since been speculated that Bob's motivation was more for drugging than assaulting the young men than it was to help them. Robert Sheldon was one of the young men that used to live with Berdella, and on April 10th he showed up to Berdella's home asking if he could stay there for a little while. Though inconvenienced, Bob agreed. On April 12th, when Bob came home from work to find the drug-addicted Sheldon intoxicated on the couch, he drugged and tied him up, keeping him for 3 days. Sheldon was subjected to such things as drain cleaner swabbed in his left eye, piano wire tied so tightly around his wrists that the bones were broken. He was beaten in the head with a rubber mallet, needles were pushed into his fingertips, and he had his ears injected with caulking material. A tattoo reading the word "hot" was also put on his arm by Berdella. This all came with the regular sexual assaults, both directly with Berdella or with foreign objects. Bob took the torture up a notch. For the first time, Bob would do something to Sheldon that would continue through the next victims. There is a notation in the horrible journal, EK, which is what Berdella would write when he electrocuted his victims by clamping alligator clamps to their skin, usually tender spots like the nipples or testicles, and shocked them with 7,700 volts of electricity. He did this to Robert Sheldon at 3 a.m. Bob continued this torture for 3 days, eventually killing 20-year-old Robert Sheldon when a man came to work on his house. Bob didn't want to get caught, obviously, and placed a plastic bag over Sheldon's head, effectively killing him. He also took a picture of Sheldon with the bag over his head, but has claimed it was directly after the bag was placed there and that in the photo, he was still alive. After Sheldon died, he then dismembered the body, taking 2 days to do it, leaving the unfinished portion in the bathtub overnight, and threw it away in the trash when he was finished. But this time, Berdella wouldn't throw away the whole body. He would keep Sheldon's head in the freezer, and eventually he buried it in the backyard in his garden. When questioned by authorities on why he did these things to Robert Sheldon, Berdella said that it was mainly because Sheldon would constantly show up at his house with no warning and expect accommodations, then be intoxicated the whole time. He said Sheldon became an inconvenience and is quoted as saying, "The best I can interpret what happened was the impulsive behavior that started with Jerry Howell became a reality for me." Robert Sheldon's skull would be found during a search of Berdella's house after his arrest. Just a couple of months later, the following June, Berdella found 20-year-old Mark Wallace outside in Bob's shed. He was curled up, trying to keep safe from a storm, and was extremely drunk. Bob knew Mark through another young man who would cut his lawn for him every now and again, and the three would occasionally hang out. Bob invited Mark to come inside the house. Mark was in a very vulnerable and depressed state, and Berdella could sense this and took advantage of it immediately. He offered to shoot Mark up with a sedative that would, quote, make him feel better. Mark didn't protest, and when Bob shot him up with the drugs, Mark fell unconscious. Bob immediately started taking photographs of the unconscious young man and tied him up the same way as the rest, logging every action into his horrible journal, along with entries that say he also sexually assaulted Wallace with foreign objects, as well as raping him. The next day, Bob arrived home from work to find Wallace trying to escape from his binds. But Bob merely injected him with more tranquilizer and continued the rape and torture. Bob clamped alligator clips to Mark's nipples during intercourse, stating in an interview that he was beginning to want sadomasochistic sex. Bob would also occasionally club Mark in the back of the head with a rubber mallet to keep him disoriented. In one of the entries in the horrible journal, on June 23, 1985 at 7 p.m., while sticking syringe needles into Mark's back, he noticed there was no reaction and logged 7 p.m., no signs of life. Berdella then again dismembered the body with a saw and a knife and threw it out with the trash. It is because of this method of disposing that he came to be known as the Kansas City Butcher. With these young men turning up missing, it was getting out around the drug and prostitution and gay communities to steer clear of Berdella, and they all warned each other of the potential danger of leaving with Bob.
He had pictures of guys that he had did things to, marks on him and things.
Walter James Ferris was an acquaintance of Berdella's, introduced through a common friend. Bob had sold Ferris and the friend, named Gene Shaw, a bottle of chlorpromazine, which they complained was bad and later traded it back to Bob for some marijuana. In one instance, Berdella had sold some drugs to the two men, and shortly afterwards, police showed up questioning Bob about it. Berdella suspected that Ferris and his friend had set him up. Bob didn't hear from them again for months. Until one day, Bob saw Ferris hitchhiking and picked him up. This led to somewhat of a rekindle in the friendship, and Ferris and Shaw began continuously showing up unannounced and asking for drugs. On September 26th, Ferris invited Bob to meet him at a local gay bar called the Midnight Sun. Angered by the interaction with the drug agent and annoyed by Ferris's behavior the last couple days, while at the bar, Bob made the decision to capture Ferris. After the bar, Berdella invited Ferris back to his house for some dinner. Ferris accepted, and Bob served microwave burritos and chili laced with tranquilizers. Ferris was unconscious within minutes. Berdella then undressed Ferris, tied him to the bed, and began his regular practice of sexually assaulting his new captor. Ferris would only slightly react to anything at this point, as he was so sedated. Once Ferris began to fight back, Berdella hooked him up to a 7,700 volt shock device, this time attaching the wires to Ferris's buttocks, shoulder, and testicles. After heavily assaulting and abusing Ferris nearly non-stop for 5 full hours, Berdella made some final notes in his log about Ferris. Here they are. At 11:30, he gave him 2.5 cc's of ketamine to the neck and shoulder. His gag was loose, and there was no resisting in retying him. At 11:45, he had very delayed breathing, and he was snoring. At 12 o'clock, 86, which means dead. And where that term comes from is actually a restaurant term. Bob Berdella worked as a chef for a long time, and 86 is a restaurant term. Like, say you were ordering a hamburger and you didn't want tomatoes on it, and you told that to the server would write down on the pad, hamburger 86 tomatoes. So 86 means gone, stopped, no more. So that's why he put in 86 for his death. Berdella then took Ferris into his bedroom and again drained the blood from his body, dismembered him, and the next morning sent him out with the trash. Ferris's driver's license was found in Berdella's house during the search. Bob stated later during an interview that Ferris had a very deep, raspy voice that kept him from being able to scream out for help. It was this that gave Berdella the idea to use Drano on future victims' voice boxes. 21-year-old Todd Stoops was a longtime acquaintance of Bob's. He, along with Todd's wife, had previously stayed at Bob's house for quite some time, and they knew each other quite well. They met at 10th and McGee, a well-known place for male prostitutes to earn their living. After not seeing or hearing from Stoops for a couple of years, on June 17, 1986, Bob ran into Todd Stoops at Liberty Park. At first glance, Stoops didn't recognize Berdella, but once he realized who it was, he jumped right into the car and the two men started talking. Stoops asked Berdella if he could take him to buy some drugs. They did, and ended up at Berdella's house. Bob had already made the decision to capture Stoops. Once in the house, Berdella gave Stoops a glass of milk and a peanut butter sandwich, both laced with potent tranquilizers. Stoops passed out shortly after eating, and so it began again. Berdella first injected Stoops with ketamine, and then sexual torture began. After a couple of hours had passed, Berdella came at Stoops with the electricity. That first night, Todd Stoops was tortured continuously for 17 hours straight. Berdella had also graduated to psychological torture, whipping Stoops with a belt whenever he would fight back. In Berdella's own words, "I was trying to terrify him." Todd Stoops was the first one to get the Drano injection treatment. In an attempt to destroy his voice, Bob Berdella injected drain cleaner into Stoops' neck surrounding his voice box. There was a point where Todd pleaded for a sandwich and a soda, but due to his non-compliance of some of the assaults, he was denied this request, and Todd broke down and began crying. On July 1st at 11 a.m., 14 days into Todd Stoops' torture, Berdella bathed him and took him back into the room. A half an hour later, Todd Stoops was dead. Bob then, again, drained Todd's body of all of its blood, dismembered him in the bathtub, and put him out with the trash. Bob's final murder victim was 20-year-old Larry Pearson. Berdella had noticed Pearson wandering around Bob's shop, and one day Pearson came in and they began talking. A short time later, Pearson was arrested for indecent exposure. He called Berdella to help post his bond. Bob agreed on the condition that Larry would ride out to Ohio with him, and he did. Pearson actually ended up moving in with Berdella and crashing on his couch. Bob started getting upset when Pearson wouldn't get a job and didn't pay any rent. Soon after, Larry and Bob went to go see a movie together, and that's when Bob decided that Larry Pearson was going to be his next, quote-unquote, patient. When Pearson started to complain that he wasn't feeling well, Bob offered him some antibiotics, which were actually tranquilizers, which Pearson accepted. When Berdella noticed they weren't knocking him out, he began drinking with Pearson, knowing that the alcohol would speed things up. A short while later, Larry Pearson was unconscious. This time, due to the size of Pearson, Berdella dragged him into the basement rather than carrying him upstairs. Down in the basement, Berdella tied Pearson's hands above his head with a rope tied to the ceiling and began injecting him with tranquilizers and giving him the electric shock treatment. Bob has said that a lot of times during his captivity, Pearson's sexual encounters were pretty cooperative. Bob then laid a speech on Pearson that if he cooperated, the punishments would be less severe. There was a time when Larry asked Berdella, "Can I ask you a question?" And Berdella answered, "No." Another time, Pearson had yelled for help because the piano wire his hands were tied with were hurting his hands very badly. Bob responded by punishing Pearson with 5 shocks of electricity and covered his head with a pillowcase. And another instance where Pearson asked Berdella, "What about my mom?" Then the normal routine. Only this time he tried to break Pearson's hands by swinging a metal bar into them. Bob said this was to incapacitate him, so basically he had no hands to try to escape with. One time Larry asked Berdella, "Is this happening because I didn't obey you?" And Bob responded that it was because of Pearson's love of fantasy and wizards that made him angry, and that, quote, "This is reality. You now have to deal with this being reality," unquote. Pearson was the longest to survive, being held captive for over a month and a half. This was due to him being very cooperative with Berdella after a couple of very stern warnings. He became so under Bob's control that he started calling Berdella Master Bob. He also started cooperating with the electric shocks to the point where Berdella didn't even need to tie Pearson's hands while administering them anymore. One night, during a sexual encounter, Pearson whispered, "I'm going to die." Bob logged it into his horrible journal, but claimed later that, quote, "He was just saying that to help me out sexually. He didn't really think he was going to die." There was a very long period of time that Berdella did not torture Pearson at all. He had become completely dominated, but not for long. A plan was brewing in Pearson's head. One day, while Bob was forcing Pearson to perform orally on him, Pearson bit Berdella's penis so hard that it nearly severed it off. After a brief confrontation while Bob panicked and cleaned himself up, Bob tied Pearson back up and with a large wooden stick beat Pearson severely, breaking his jaw, ribs, and possibly fracturing his skull. Bob then left Pearson to suffer while he went to the Menorah Medical Center to the emergency room. When he was told he would have to stay in the hospital for a couple of days, Bob told them that he needed to return home briefly to make sure his dogs would be taken care of while he was away. Bob returned home and immediately killed Pearson by tying a plastic garbage bag around his head. After Larry Pearson was dead, Bob left his body tied up in the house while he went for his stay in the hospital. 2 days later, on Friday, August 7th, Bob dragged Pearson's body into the basement, and within a couple of days, Bob dismembered Pearson, keeping his head, and put the rest of him out with the trash. He then wrapped Pearson's head in plastic and placed it in the freezer for a week or so while Bob was still healing from his wound. There was a time during a jail interview while Bob was recounting this particular story where one of the prosecuting attorneys had to excuse himself from the interview so he could go into the bathroom and literally cry. When Berdella was finally feeling up to it, he took Pearson's head with skin and vertebrae still attached and buried it in the same spot where Sheldon's skull had been buried, removing Sheldon's skull and replacing it with Pearson's. Berdella then removed all of the teeth from Sheldon's skull and placed it in the closet in his artifact room and left it there for police to find months later. Both skulls were located during the search of Berdella's house. It is worth mentioning that Berdella had confessed to trying all this out on a stray dog before he took any human captives. Keeping the same type of notes while he experimented on the animal, Berdella claimed he wasn't trying to torture the animal and was just trying to figure out how to administer healthcare to his own dogs without injuring them. There were rumors that Berdella would prepare meals with human meat and feed it to people at the flea market, and that he was selling jewelry made from the bones of his victims, and other fairly outlandish rumors that Berdella refuted. There was no reason to believe any of it was true, and chances are it wasn't.
You recall we mentioned before that there were reports in the Westport flea market where you had your shop that people would say, oh yes, I do remember he had these strange smelling dishes of food, that he had bead bones. And later on there was speculation, at least in the community and in some aspects of the media, that the remains of your victim were somehow being transported and prepared as meals and prepared as jewelry in your shop.
And that you could question any of these people, and they'd be able to tell you that the food was good. There was nothing suspect about the turkey or ham or beef.
There was an episode of Geraldo Rivera where a woman claimed she was in the same satanic cult as Berdella and that she had witnessed a human sacrifice to him. This was not true.
We were at a meeting in the area, and he was up on the platform in a throne, which symbolizes that that sacrifice at that particular meeting was for him, was done for him.
So he was in an exalted position. He was a VIP.
Yes, he was.
What happened there at that ceremony?
There was a young man killed, a young boy. He was 16 years old.
Did you ever tell the police about any of this?
No, I didn't.
Why?
People don't believe you when you talk about these things. People just do not believe these things happen.
Now let's go back to the one that got away, Chris Bryson. Chris Bryson, who we were discussing at the start of this story, was Bob's final victim. After injecting drain cleaner near Bryson's vocal cords and warning him to keep quiet, Bob used the electric shock treatment on Bryson and beat his hands badly with a metal bar. Then, more electricity. Bob attached the electric clamps to Bryson's thigh and testicles and started zapping him with 7,700 volts, followed by more injections. Bryson eventually passed out.
All I know is the whole thing was evil.
This 22-year-old, call him Jay, escaped from the House of Horrors wearing only a dog collar. For 4 days, he had been ritualistically tortured by a man named Bob Berdella.
He took the transformer and hooked it to my genitals and stepped back and took pictures while I'm flopping around.
When he awoke, Bob was in the room with him, and Bob began a terrifying welcome speech. You are now my sex toy. You are never going to see the outside world again. The only things you need to think about are you, me, and this house. Don't try to fight me, or you'll just get more of what you had earlier. He then reminded Bryson what he had already gone through and that there was a lot more to be done. What you got is nothing compared to what you can have, Bob said. Bob went off on the rules for Bryson, such as covering his mouth if he wants to speak, and if Bob feels like letting him speak, he'll touch Bryson's hand with his finger, signaling that he may talk. But if he's to break any of these rules, he would get the metal bar and worse. After sexually assaulting Bryson, Bob continued his lecture. You did not choose to be here, but you are. For you to survive being here, it could either be rough or it could be easy. He then explained about the small rewards he would get for cooperating. More of the same went on with Bryson for 3 days, but on the 4th day, while Berdella was at work, Bryson made the decision that he was no longer willing to go along with this horror. Bob allowed Bryson to watch a game on TV one night, and during a post-game interview, one of the players said, I knew I was going to have to go through a lot to get back out on the basketball court, but I knew one day I was going to be there. This quote gave Bryson the motivation and the inspiration he needed to survive. Before Bob left for work, Bryson asked if he could have his hands tied in front of him rather than over his head so he could handle the remote for the TV. Surprisingly, Bob agreed and tied Bryson in a fashion where he could use the remote. Berdella had been bringing Bryson cigarettes and lighting them for him with a book of matches, which Bob had left in Bryson's reach this day. The stars have aligned for Chris Bryson. When Bob left for work on Bryson's 4th day in captivity, Bryson started struggling against his restraints and was able to get his hands free. Bryson was afraid to untie his feet because they were attached to the metal bed frame, and Bryson feared that Berdella had the bed rigged to electrocute him if he touched it. So, taking the book of matches that Berdella carelessly left near him, Bryson began burning through the ropes on his legs until they were free. Bryson then climbed out of the second-story window wearing nothing but the dog collar which he couldn't remove due to his damaged hands, and he jumped to freedom. A meter maid saw the whole thing and ran over to assist Bryson, taking him to the nearest neighbor and using their phone to call the police. When the police showed up, they initially didn't know what to make of Bryson's story, jumping to conclusions like rough sex gone wrong and lovers quarrel. But upon further investigation, they found reason to stake out Berdella's house, and when Berdella returned home from work, he immediately noticed the police were in front of his house. Bob approached them, asking what the problem was. He then identified himself as Robert Berdella and was arrested right there on the spot. Bob eventually confessed to everything, giving prosecutors and authorities all of the grisly details of his murder spree over the last few years. Berdella pled guilty with no trial, and the judge of the Jackson County Circuit Court sentenced Bob Berdella to multiple life sentences. While in prison, Berdella complained that he was not receiving his heart medication, and on October 8, 1992, at 3:55 p.m., died from an apparent heart attack while serving his time. His claim that his medication was being withheld from him was never investigated. And that was the end of Bob Berdella. Jerry Howell was only 20 years old. Robert Sheldon was only 18 years old. Mark Wallace was only 20 years old. James Ferris was only 20 years old. Todd Stoops was only 21 years old. Larry Pearson was only 20 years old. Other than the skulls of Sheldon and Pearson, none of the bodies were ever recovered. After his ordeal, Chris Bryson changed his name and moved to an unknown location. I truly hope he's found some peace in his life and has moved forward as much as possible from the horror he endured those few days in Bob Berdella's captivity. I want to thank you for watching this episode of Lesser Known Monsters, and if you want to see past and future episodes, please feel free to subscribe and like this video, and turn on those notifications so you know when the next episode is available, if you feel up to it. And I've been meaning to tell you this. You can go ahead and follow me on Instagram. I'll put it down here, but it's at LK_monsters with the number 1. Very long, but yes. Also, I'm starting something new, and we'll be doing a live stream show this coming Monday, May 10th, to discuss this case and this episode, and the tons of things that were left uncovered because, like I've said in the past, there's no way to fit the whole story into a half-an-hour episode. So if you'd like to join me for that, I'd love to see you there. So until next time, thanks for joining me on Lesser Known Monsters.